the hungriest and unhealthiest country in the world, or among the 2 or 3 in the world. What does that mean? And what do natural resources have to do with this nation that is among the hungriest and the unhealthiest? Picture this. Ever since I know, in Ethiopia, some 22% of the country's population, under the current regime, which has been in power for 21 years, has been dependent on international food aid, including Canadian food aid of some sort, the safety net program included. 5 million Ethiopians depend solely on remittances from people like myself, who live in the United States, from people like Obang, who live in Canada. Add those up, and you will see a picture. Ethiopia, for a long time, especially under the current government, is the world's laboratory in development aid, in humanitarian aid. So, in essence, really, there is a link between poverty and the aid business. That's one of the provocative things that I like to say. When the Ethiopian government transfers natural resources, like massive amounts of land, it does it to 2 groups of people. One, a group of firms and individuals, including the former president of Nigeria and the president of Djibouti. 36 countries, 8,000 firms are involved in Ethiopia. The tables are summarized in my book, and there is a handout if we can print them. So it tells you the side of a story that's not often told. Internally, some 500,000 hectares of the most fertile lands in Ethiopia in the south, and it happens to be in the south. Because where I come from in the north, we have practically overused the land. We have exhausted it. The last frontiers of the land that are left in northern Ethiopia, those of you who have been there would know, are around monasteries and churches. If you fly in northern part of the country, you will find sort of desertification at a massive scale. This has been going on for thousands of years. So, the land that's left even in the northern part of the country around the monasteries is even being taken over. I just want to link that to the story in the south. It's a human story that we should talk about. Now, what does it really mean? The benefits the Ethiopian government suggested to the World Bank when the first draft was written, and I saw it, are the following. The Ethiopian government said to the world that the following are the key benefits that it wishes to advance. 1, technology transfer in a country which is technologically backward. 2, food security in a country which has been food insecure for a long time. 3, employment generation. 4, poverty reduction. 5, land use, i.e. idle land that has never been used. The last is foreign exchange. I would add to this diplomatic leverage. That's one of the benefits. And we'll, I think, during the discussion, talk about diplomatic leverage. In fact, I would say, out of this set of criteria, the 2 really critical ones are foreign exchange earning, and the second one is diplomatic leverage. They go hand in hand. If you get foreign exchange, you have the means to control society. And that's what the Ethiopian government is doing. I just want to throw a couple of things and then I will stop. because I think the benefits really from the dialogue, not so much from the monologue, and I'm sort of feeling that I'm being kind of a monologue-oriented person. I don't want to do that. But let me share with you the compelling reasons why Africa is the last frontier in terms of land grab. I think, we hear a lot about, the rising consumer demand among, BRIC countries, Brazil, India, China, and the like, the GCC, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and so on, the middle class rising. Yeah, that's really sort of common knowledge. Yeah, it is one of the drivers of the scramble for Africa because it's the last frontier. Ethiopia happens to be the champion of land grab. It is the champion, in fact, of land grab. The Prime Minister of Ethiopia said a few years ago, under my watch, no Ethiopian land will be granted to anyone. That's what he said. Then what happened? What happened? Well, obviously, in a country which is ruled by a single party for 21 years, where there's absolutely no voice whatsoever, the only voice is the press controlled by the government, and it is the one that practically, propagates that there is growth. But I ask the question, growth for whom? Ethiopia is known to have grown quite a bit, and there are some internal documents in the bank that suggest that even the growth story is not growth. On the average, if you take the past several years, the average growth rate in Ethiopia is 5%. The average growth rate in sub-Saharan Africa is 6%. So there is a difference. Yeah, the biggest concentration of, really the amount of money that's received from foreign sources, and the amount of 3 billion plus per year, including the Canadian assistance for SIDA of 40 million, plus the 3.5 billion that Ethiopia receives from the diaspora, plus earnings from land transactions and so on, add up to a huge amount of money. But if people do not have say in policy, in programs, if they are dispossessed and they cannot even protest, ask the question, why? One of the characteristics of this highly centralized government, which takes land and puts it in a bank, there is a bank, a land bank, is fear. Fear. Fear permeates Ethiopian society, right and left, from north to south, from west to east. People who are scared to speak up and defend their interests can obviously not even legitimately say, why don't you leave me alone? Let me, you saw in the video. That is not only happening in Gambela, it's happening in the southern part of the country, in the Omo Valley. It's happening in the monastery areas in the north. It's happening in Oromoya. It's happening in Ogaden. It's happening in Benishangul, in the western part of the country. So one of the things that I really like to suggest to you, especially those from the SIDA community, because we need your leverage, we need you to help us, is how do we deal with fear? If people are scared to assert their rights when they are being moved, 1.5 million people are people. 300,000 people in the Omo Valley will be moved. The people around the monasteries whose lands are going to be taken away, literally we lose our identity and our culture that we built for 1,500 years of Christianity in Ethiopia. That's under threat too. So I leave you with just a thought. Where is this going to lead? The worry I have, I'll share with you my worry. It's not only about people, it's not about democracy, it's not about anything. My worry is that peace and security and stability in the Horn of Africa is at risk. And if this risk continues, And if Ethiopia explodes, there is no boundary. And if we have seen, and I'm being provocative here, if we say that the situation in Rwanda was really horrible, one of the most horrible things, the things that we need to prevent is a Rwanda-like situation in the Horn of Africa, and Ethiopia is in the center of it. Thank you.
Bruce.
I'll make a few very brief comments that perhaps will seem somewhat repetitive, but perhaps try to bring what I hear as some of the key messages that you may want to pick up in our discussion. Some relate to the film we saw, and some relate to the comments made. Some of them build upon what are some of the factors driving this, and certainly the awareness of the land grab situation came to the forefront after the food crisis of 2007 and 2008, where people started to realize that countries were acquiring land in other places in order to grow food for their own countries, and therefore be able to bypass international food commodity markets and keep prices down in their own countries. But the other was that by the time of that crisis, we already had targets set in Europe, particularly in America and other countries, for biofuel targets. And therefore, we are already seeing land be acquired to grow corn for cars instead of corn for people. And a lot of land was being taken out of production for local markets in order to satisfy the targets set by the United States and others, often with this continued support of their agriculture subsidies being redirected into these purposes. And so these are a couple of the major factors. And the one in the movie that only people are starting to become aware of is that countries with the kind of capital that Saudi Arabia and others have are more interested in the subsurface water rights than the land rights. And that, I think, was excellently brought out. But the situation in terms of who are some of the major actors relates to a point that has been made, and that is the whole concept of private-public partnerships relates in many ways to what in at least the UN system and even in the larger international financial institutions is the view that there is inadequate resources within those structures to meet the agriculture investment needs in Africa. But also this is the same issues appear in Asia and in Latin America. And so therefore it's interesting to see how is this being rationalized. I mean, if we look at the World Bank, who used to sit on the board of the International Land Coalition where I worked, we saw everything from willing selling, willing buyer approaches and all of the concerns from Via Campesine and others about strategies there. And then at the 2010 World Bank meeting on land policy that brings together many of the actors, we saw a statement about land availability. We asked, people in the audience asked for the evidence of on what basis are you saying land is available in Africa and other places? And that information was not shared, but it reinforced what the panelists have just said, is that based upon aerial photography and GPS information showing land at that particular moment in time not being used, although clearly needing to go through a fallow period in view of especially the semi-arid and arid zones. And we also saw that this land was defined as having low levels of productivity. Well, we know, those of us who've been involved, with many of you in countries such as Africa, the reason why the pastoralist and nomadic way of life is suitable, it's suitable to those agroecological conditions. And certainly they have a lower level of productivity, and attempts to turn them into intensive farming have not historically worked. But there was a rationale that there is available land, and I think we have to really dispute that. The other was the whole issue of buying, selling, leasing. We've heard reports of leases at 99 years. Investor evidence says that if you do want to lease, that you get an adequate return on investment in land almost anywhere in the world at the 20 to 25 year mark. And therefore, if you're going to have land temporarily leased out in order to generate income, even if that income was properly directed to help the poor get resources to make their land more productive, you certainly don't need this long-term leasing situation. And currently, 18 of the countries leasing land in sub-Saharan Africa are food deficit countries. So where is the logic in this? But it's a rationale that's being used in the international community to substantiate this, with a view that this will be made manageable by establishing voluntary guidelines on the ways in which land will be invested. Those who followed this, and I know there are many in the room that have been following it, question, one, the effect of voluntary guidelines. However, the right to food grew out of voluntary guidelines, so we shouldn't be completely skeptical if that's a starting point, but they certainly are seen to be somewhat weak. But as Canadians, we may ask the question that what is our government trying to do? It did not, as I understand, effectively take part in the debate about these voluntary guidelines, because when the people who were representing Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, DFATE and CETA, who were taking part in these World Bank discussions about voluntary guidelines, were asked what position is Canada going to take, they said, we don't really have a mandate to take a position because we're being told that Canada doesn't invest directly in land programs, and therefore why would we take this up? We're interested in what its effects will be, but we don't have a role to speak on this. Again, something that we may question, because we do know of funding such as in Cambodia and other places where CETA has put substantial sums of money into World Bank and other programs that deal with the land question. The other is that a lot of this continues to be predicated on the idea that if we're going to feed people within countries and globally, that commercial agriculture is still what sort of rules the day, and a denial of all of the research and evidence of the inverse relationship between farm size. Small farmers, therefore, we know, produce more food per unit of land if we make the same investments, provide the same opportunities that we've historically seen provided to commercial and other forms of agriculture. And the other is, why is this happening at this particular moment in time? Well, some of us understand it to be because basically we have underdeveloped regulatory and legislative regimes in many of the countries where land is being acquired, but there are efforts being made. Take in Africa, as weak again as they may be, there was a serious effort by the heads of state of the African Union who passed guidelines in order to try to look at the management of land and to avoid the land management systems being imposed from abroad. So people are trying to fast track while prices are low. There's complicit elites that are willing to take part, and the underdeveloped regulatory markets mean that you better get it now before these things come into place and we have proper governance structures to oversee land. The other thing I would just close on, because there's many things that I know can be added from the group here, is that this issue, as mentioned, is not just an issue from afar. I think there's a dimension, and I hope that we'll hear of some of the research being done in Canada to try to look at which Canadian companies are interested or actively involved in acquiring land. We've heard mention of pension and sovereign wealth funds, and there is work being done which will give us the evidence to be able to speak in terms of people within our own country and what's being done by Canadian companies in investments. But the other you may be interested to know, at the 2011 meeting of the Canadian Land Trust Conference, and the land trust organizations first and foremost are looking at conserving and protecting vulnerable lands in Canada. This was not a topic of land grabbing in Canada and land investments, but it became a topic where it was identified that many of the green space areas around some of our major cities are being acquired by Koreans and other investors with the interest in the gravel and underlying mineral resources in those areas. And we found finally at this meeting, and some of us, because this is an issue of which we're obviously very passionate, that we're trying to develop a network, because representatives of every province were able to cite examples of foreign investments in land in activities that would, in their view, be contrary to many of the environmental and production issues that will affect both farmers and affect other uses of the land. So I think there are a number of dimensions that would allow us to bring this home and give us ways to focus our interests as Canadians here in Canada, where we can act both on the global and on the national level.
Thank you, Bruce. I'm just looking at the clock, and it's already 10:30. And I'm just wondering, before proceeding to the pointed questions that Bruce was going to pose, whether we should hear from our audience at this point. Okay? So why don't we...
Why are they fighting?
Okay, so wind-up time. I'm sorry, not everyone who wanted to take the floor was able to, but If you have a few minutes afterwards, we can do it informally. So back to the panel. Who wants to go first? Aklog?
Yeah,
very, very brief.
It's hard to be brief. First, I think, first point, Ethiopia cannot achieve food security if it gives up resources. There's evidence, ample evidence. You can't expect as a government to say to the Ethiopian people, I'll get foreign exchange and then I'll go to the market and buy to feed you. That's a model. That's the Ethiopian government. And it will earn about 10 billion by the time Karuturi, Saudi Star, and others would have reached a point of fruition. So that's fact. The long-term interest of the investor community is a stable and empowered and participatory Ethiopia. That's really the way I would approach it. Because in the long term, investment is extremely risky to the extent that the society is risky. Second, the taxpayers in Western countries are not really getting their money's worth in terms of aid. Because the evidence on the ground, there is statistic after statistic that the UN has. Everybody has. The fact remains that per capita income in Ethiopia today is 350 versus the African average of 1,070. So, where is the money going? Third, the land and waters in Ethiopia have become sources of corruption. Every day, if you read the local newspapers, there are accusations and counter-accusations arising from land transactions. This is illustrated by the fact that UNDP wrote a scathing report a few years ago, saying that Ethiopia was corruption-ridden. Transparency International has documented several times. The latest is Global Financial Integrity, which reveals the following. One, $11.9 billion stolen and illicit outflow of funds in Ethiopia from 2000 to 2008. In 2009 alone, US $3.26 billion, American dollars. That is actually a combined export earning plus net foreign aid. All of it went out. So, foreign aid makes a contribution. So, there is really, I think, one of the worry points for me, and where we can leverage you, because you are experienced and you have leverage. You have people can hear you. The policy dimension that you talked about, sir, is peace and stability and security in the region are threatened. If this continues, land is going to be the last trigger of conflagration. And by the way, it really invites external forces. And the book that I wrote shows that. Who are the external players in Ethiopia where this diplomatic leverage is not going to really work ultimately, because many millions of people are affected and the region is affected. The last point. So, in terms of recommendation, my plea is there has to be a global voice, on land grab in general and Ethiopian land grab in particular. Global voice. Not scattered voices, but a coalition. That's one. Second, I think the PBS report, is a scathing report. There are other reports. But the thing is, they are not being translated into public policy action. Public policy action vis-a-vis the World Bank, for example. Inside, outside, approach. The last point. I don't believe that even the World Bank doesn't have reasonable voices. There are. I know. I work there. There are reasonable voices. We need to reach out to them. Because, they can help us. The inside, story of who can help us within and who can help us outside. Outside, I think it's really activists like you. And I'm, again, very thankful for giving me the opportunity to air my frustrations as well as my hopes. Thank you.
Thank you. Who wants to go next?
Thank you.
I don't really have more to say. I just want to say thank you, Roy, and also for the university being here. I think that the professor put it very well. That is something that we cannot really set aside. That I think is a responsibility of humanity in a way, in the sense, whether we like it or not, people can ignore what's going on, saying that this is in Horn of Africa, but it comes to us all the time. In terms of the problem, it may look far away, but it comes to our living room. In terms of Somalia, in terms of Rwanda, in terms of again the angers, so it's all the way come back to us. And I think that where we could focus, and there's group who are working like Oxfam, and there are other who are really doing a very good job, but they are very few. There's African proverb say that if you want to go fast, go alone, and if you want to go further, go together. In the sense that I think this is the stage where we are in now, that people are talking about the land grab. And as I say, the land grab to me is really not the land grab, is grabbing the lives of these people. And recently, one example I could give is in Tanzania. Someone told him that I can give you, money for this land, and then give them like about almost 10,000 US dollars. The gentleman thought it's a lot of money. And then just the money was gone in less than 2 years, and he come back, I want my land back. So, but the guy cannot give. The same thing is in Ethiopia. The Indian man who was there, instead of clearing the mango, he bought the mango from the local people. But the people want to go back to get the mango when it's ready. They say it's not yours anymore. It's now mine. So this problem is just going on and on and on. But the problem is people in Africa have no voice. For example, the Homo Bali Felix is talking about, a place like Obang Metho, close to 300,000 people. There's only 1% out of those groups in the diaspora. You can see that in terms of the education. They've been marginalized, discriminated by their own government, and they are not good for anything. The government don't value them. Only their land, and which their own thing that really make them to survive. Now it's been taken away from them. So, in a sense, as I say earlier, what makes us to be a human being is not only to communicate in language and technology. Above all is the emotion. That emotion makes us to cry when someone dies. That emotion when we see a blood of a human make our body. That really is emotion that we have to use. In this way, then, how do we use it in this sense? In a sense, I think in this case, we have to talk about it. We have to tell people, we as a Canadian, we give money, the money go to this country, and instead of feeding their own people from the land they have, they're taking away the land. If most of the Canadians know what we know now, I'm telling you they would do something about it. So number one is we have to be aware. We cannot do anything unless we are aware. So this, I think the professor put it very well. It is not something we can leave alone. It has to go from people. I think it's organically. And as I say that, I'm a Saskatchewan guy. Saskatoon was my home. I've been here now for 2 months, moving here, but I still feel like I'm visiting someday. When I wake up, I feel like I'm still going to go back to Saskatchewan, but I'm not. So I am here. The groups have been here. I've been working with them. So if there are some people that Roy is here, we will try to do whatever we can. The good part of it is we have connection to people back at home. So you can hear what's going on there, and then we may try also, as we say, to get the message to those people. So I think there's a need for us to work together. If before we go to globals, we have to start it community.
Thank you, Obang. Felix?
Really quickly, we just scratched the surface in this discussion. I remember saying last night, I thought 3 hours would be a long time. It just flew by. I think there's a bunch of areas that, or a bunch of aspects of this issue that just aren't being talked about anywhere. And I think security that you've touched on is a huge one. Tying into the risk for the investor. The South Omo land grabs that are happening there with 300,000 agri-pastoralists are being removed from their land. They're all heavily armed. 1847, but they're all heavily armed. Every interview I did, they were pledging war. They're going to fight, they're going to die for their land. This is the reality, and it hasn't exploded yet, but it is going to explode. My first exposure to Ethiopia 12 years ago, I had a discussion with an American woman who was executive director of an NGO who was leaving a country shortly, and she said, "I'm leaving because this country's going to become the next Rwanda." Not really. Understanding of this. And almost everyone you talk to really says that. It's really, really scary, and it's happening because of these types of policies. I mean, also, there's a complex series of reasons and interactions, but these policies are not helping. So we talk about, is Canada involved in land grabs? How are we involved? I'm not sure that's the right way to frame that sort of that conversation. I think we should be looking at how can Canada use the support that it gives sub-Saharan African countries, whether it's aid, whether it's diplomacy, whether it's security. You know, we give so much support to Africa. We should be using that as leverage to ensure that local people have power, that situation not being created is going to cause conflict, which will be in no one's best interest. And if we've learned anything in the last little while, it seems to be that foreign governments don't really step up until things are really, really bad. So we bring lots of money, effort into Somalia, into Sudan, because things are really bad. How about let's put money and effort into something before it gets really, really bad? So,
great. Thank you, Felix. Bruce, and then I'll let Anuradha have the last one.
In terms of public policy, and I'm very encouraged by what we heard is happening in South Sudan, but from my global work with the Land Coalition, one of the things that we frequently would see is that people thought they were on the right track if we could get governments to develop legislation, regulations, and juridical systems to protect people's property rights, and all too often we saw it just led to further elite capture. In that, it did not initially deal with historical injustices. So what ended up happening, by putting these measures into constitutions, etc., we legitimized land that was ill-gotten in the first place. And so we have to be very clear that the starting point cannot be cadasters and land administration systems. They may be needed, but they have to be based upon first addressing these historical injustices. Three areas of one, a coming event that may be used by some of you, if you wish, as a follow-up. And it sounds like an advertisement because I worked for them at one point, but the executive director of the International Land Coalition, Majojo Niase, is going to be in Ottawa on the 30th of April and the 1st of May. I would encourage you to look at their website. They have a huge website updated weekly on commercial pressures on land. They found the diplomatic way to deal with their intergovernmental and their peasant movements. And they have just published a major study, it was 2 years in the making, on land grabbing in all of the regional areas, and you may find this another source of information and data. If you are interested in, there will be some public events announced for this, and if I can get the email list of those who've come today, I'll see that you're informed of the program while he is here. Secondly, is you may find it interesting to follow the website or contact, if you have contacts, Roy's former organization, the North-South Institute, because related to the question of today is that there's efforts being made in their research program to look further at how the principles and the work already done on free, prior, and informed consent can be applied and used more broadly in terms of some of the many questions we've answered here today of how is land determined to be available and how are communities consulted. Further to which, an additional, or perhaps as the extension, Roy could correct me if I'm wrong, but a major research project of which it looks like there's significant funding has just been articulated and the prospectus put out, and it's on governance of natural resources. So in terms of the prominent role of the North-South Institute, that's just been awarded a significant global award for its research of research bodies of its type. These are two pieces of research that may be ways to add to the evidence, and the North-South Institute certainly hopes that this will add more evidence, somewhat reinforcing Richard's call for how do we get the basis to become involved if we're not. This may be a source. And finally, in case you are not aware, debates of this type are ongoing in other forums, and there is, based in the Ottawa community, a group, an informal group called the Land Study Group that currently brings together about 40 individuals who are concerned and want a place to informally discuss land questions. Many people in the room are part of this, but many may not be. This group meets on an occasional basis. It follows Chatham House rules, so there's no attribution, which has meant that people from different organizations including many different departments of government, take part in that discussion because they know no one's going to quote them as this is a position that we heard expressed by a CEDA or a DFATE official. It's really an attempt to try to build some understanding, and as this meeting today has done, to share information so that we could all become better informed and understand what may be new and other ways to advance this cause of improving the rights and avoiding the continued exploitation of people. If you're interested in this at the present time, Lloyd Strachan, next to Bob Mitchell, and myself are currently convening meetings of this group, and one of our meetings will be when this person from the Land Coalition is here. So contact me later. Again, we'll inform you of this. So the Land Study Group, the ILC visit, and the North-South Institute may be places that you could look into whether they would help you to advance the interest that we hope has been provoked today.
Thank you, Bruce, including for the plug for my former institute, the North-South Institute, for which I remain very proud. Last word to Anuradha.
Well, first of all, thank you all for being here, and thank you to the organizers. For more research, definitely our work is available on the website of aklog.org. Like I said, this year we are going to continue investigations and putting out specific land deals that we're looking at, starting actually the first release being on April 1st. A Fortune 500 company that is very involved in Cameroon, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Cambodia, loves to sue people, so we're actually getting ready for that. Has even tried to sue the United Nations because they kind of highlighted what this company was doing in Liberia. So we'll continue to shine the light. Second, the report that I mentioned, will make sure that everyone gets it here, because I think the US funds that are investing in agriculture, which are problematic deals. Third is we're also putting out a report looking at the human rights connections all over the world. You know, it's again, you look at Sierra Leone, people arrested, put away in jail for 8 days with no food, just because they were trying to stop the bulldozers from going into their fields. Or you think of Thailand, you know, people being killed. So the human rights violations go beyond free, prior, informed consent to plain civil political rights that we understand very well in the Western countries, at least. So we'll be putting out those reports. Lastly, the only thing I would say is, you know, I think we really need to be unreasonable and ask the question, when we talk about development, I mean, let's look at how the US farm sector developed. Look at the Farm Bill, which went into promoting US corporations. Then look at the US food aid. It is bought in the US, packed in the US, shipped in the US. You look at the Asian tigers, it was government's very heavy involvement in both industry and agriculture. You mentioned China. So it is fascinating that suddenly these countries who have prospered by very directly being involved in protecting their agriculture are now telling African and other developing countries, do as we say, not as we do. I'm a dual citizen of the United States as well as India. I do not have the right to buy land in India. No. It's very clear. So I think it's also important to look at the investment rules that we have, though we are hearing about investment by the Koreans and others in Canada, in the United States, and Australia and New Zealand. How can we live in this, you know, it's like a schizophrenic personality. We have different set of rules for Africa, while we have very different rules. And you know, you might not like the word racist, but it's nothing else but very racist policy making, which continues taking of places such as Africa because we think it's a birthright to steal, to pillage, and rape the continent because it's okay. So I think it is time, I would say, be unreasonable. Let's push the limits of the debate and stop coming up with voluntary guidelines. It's time for some mandatory stuff.
Great note on which to end. Let me, in closing, I'm not going to try and summarize the discussion, although I will say that our group has talked about writing up a summary after the meeting, so we'll talk about that over lunch. Just a couple of things. I totally agree with Felix's comment to the effect that we just scratched the surface. So there's a lot more work to be done. I know that a lot of people here are actually working on these issues, but we encourage you to stay together. And that's brings me to Obang's allusion to the African proverb, if you want to run fast, you go alone. And that made me, by the way, think about Ethiopians who always seem to cross the finish line first. If you want to go far, go
Inside.
together. So going together is one of the main messages that comes out of this meeting. And in closing, I'd like to draw your attention to the recommended and relevant links from our speakers that was drawn together by Annie, who's just joined us now at the back of the room, which is available on hard copy. We should find a way of putting this on a website so people can just click on the links. But anyway, further resources will appear. But if you don't mind, please help join me in thanking each and every of our wonderful and enlightening speakers and people who've come here today to join this discussion. Thank you.